I am going to start with the inside scoop about how this particular story came to be because it was a unusually curvy and bumpy road that brought this to publication, and so I thought maybe I would begin just by giving you guys the inside scoop on how this came to be. So I went back into my files, and just out of curiosity, I went to go and look to see what my original inspiration for this novella was. So I started conceiving and imagining the Misty River romance series coming up on 2 years ago now. Not quite, but almost 2 years ago, I began imagining this series. And at the time, I jotted down all the ideas I had for the series. And at the time, even back then, I did imagine that I would write a prequel novella. And the reason for that is because I really like to have something that connects in with a series that is free. And I did this with a Bradford Sisters series as well. I released Then Came You prior to the first novel in that series, which was True to You. And it seemed to be, a fairly decent success. And so I really wanted to do the same thing this time. However, I had contracted with my publisher, Bethany House, for the 3 novels in the Misty River romance series, and I did not contract for any novellas. So I knew that if I was to write any, that I would publish those independently, which meant that, scheduling-wise, I would write Stay With Me first, and then I would write the prequel novella second, even though it would be released first, which is all kind of confusing. But this is the sort of gymnastics that we writers are often doing on our end, where we're working on one story, and then we're shifting gears and we're working on another, and maybe we'll write them in a different order than you'll read them, and all of that kind of good stuff. It just makes everything all that much more interesting on our end. So I went back in my files to see what my original idea was for the novella. And I did have both of the 2 main characters' names already in my head. So I have written down Eli Price and Penelope Quinn. I didn't end up changing any of that. Again, this was about 2 years ago that I wrote this down. I said hero, fighter pilot. And so right then, I think the very first inspiration I had was fighter pilot. And here's why. I'm sure some of you, almost all of you probably, remember this movie right here. So this came out in the spring of my freshman year of high school. I'm sure a lot of you are much younger than me. Some of you are around my age, some of you are older. But for me, this came out in the spring of my freshman year of high school. And I still remember going to see it with my great friend named Carolyn. She and I went to the little movie theater near her house, and we saw this, and it blew us away. I remember us just sitting outside the movie theater afterwards, just fangirling over it for ages, because we just couldn't get over how much we loved it and how much of an impact this had. So I've never forgotten the impact that this had, and I've always been fascinated with this career. And so way back 2 years ago, I thought to myself, I want to write a novella about a fighter pilot. So I had that in place. At the time, I wasn't sure whether or not Eli was going to be a part of the Miracle 5. So if you've only read the novella, you might have noticed that I mentioned the Miracle 5 briefly. And at this time, I wasn't sure yet whether Eli was going to be one of those or not. Genevieve, the heroine of Stay With Me, is one of the Miracle 5. And the Miracle 5 are a group of kids who were trapped in the rubble for 8 days when they were in middle school on a middle school mission trip to El Salvador. And God miraculously saved them. And the media and the whole world was following their story, waiting and wondering and praying to see if they would be released. And so what's been really cool about the Misty River romance series is that all of the novels feature one of those kids who are now grown into adults. And I've been able to explore how that event of the earthquake and God's miraculous saving of them affected their entire lives from then on. So at that, back 2 years ago, I wasn't sure whether or not Eli would be one of them. It turns out that he's not. If he's not, I wrote, let him be close friends with Sam, which is the route I ended up taking. Through this story, the reader learns about the Miracle Five and just how much they've affected the town. And then I have a question mark because I wasn't sure. And then later I said it would be good to keep the details of the earthquake tragedy vague. And that's actually the route that I ended up taking. As you'll see, I just hit on it briefly. I don't go into it much. I decided to wait and explore all of that in much more detail in Stay With Me. For the heroine, this is what I had written down initially. I said maybe her dad was in the military and she grew up being jerked from place to place. She doesn't want to live the rest of her life in the same fashion. She wants to stay in her mountain town in Georgia and never leave. And then I said maybe these two are married. So my original title was Come Back to Me. That was what I had in mind initially. So then last summer in July was finally when I had time to actually write this novella. And so this is when I started to flesh out the story. This is when I really looked into what the plot might be and when I decided that the plot would be something that revolved around Penelope's brother's family and their medical crisis. That's when I decided that his wife, Theo's wife, would be having this medical issue and that someone would need to step in and really help the family take care of the newborn baby. So that's when I fleshed all that out. At that time, I also decided on Penelope's job, which obviously I didn't have in mind when I initially conceived of this story. I decided on personalities for the characters, and also I named all of the secondary characters. For example, Aubrey, I had first named her Anna, and then Morgan, and then Eva, before I eventually decided she was going to be named Aubrey. So she went through several different names. I also kind of fine-tuned the conflict, the romantic conflict between the characters, and I wrote the rough draft. So this is when, during that phase, was when I also kind of found inspiration pictures for the characters, and I hesitate to show these to people who haven't yet read the novella, but since all of you have, I'm guessing, I'll show these to you. These might not be at all what you pictured when you were reading. And I love that readers can imagine the characters differently than I did. I think that's part of the beauty and the joy of reading. And so I want to encourage you, you know, when you're reading my books, I give you some details about their appearance, but I really want you to fill in the rest of that within your own mind. But I thought at this point it might be fun just so you can see where I was coming from when I was imagining them. This is what I found that I thought Penelope might look like. So when I'm describing her hair, this is what I'm trying to describe, which was challenging, you know, to try to get this across. But this is kind of how I saw her. I saw this photo and I was really struck by it. I use inspiration photos, but I don't use them as blueprints so much as just jumping off places. So I look at this and then I flesh out the character in my own imagination from here. So this is kind of a starting place for me. This isn't exactly the way that I pictured her in my mind, but this was a good beginning spot. So that's where I started with her. And then with Eli, I actually searched around quite a bit, and kind of like with Aubrey's name, I went through a few different sort of inspiration photos until I found one that I thought suited. Now in this case, in my imagination, he didn't end up looking just 100% like this again, but this is kind of along the lines that I pictured, except hair perhaps a little lighter. And as you might notice, this inspiration does look, you know, fairly similar to this cover. So when the cover designer asked me what my inspiration was for him, because we knew we were going to put the hero on the cover, I sent her this and she sent me this. And when she sent me this, I was immediately like, yes, sold, please. Because this was relatively close to my perception of what Eli looked like. And so you can kind of see how that came to be, how that cover came to be. So I wrote the rough draft last July, and I actually followed through on the thing that I had thought about from the beginning, which was maybe these two are married. Readers all the time reach out to me and they say, I would love to read a romance about a married couple. Will you write a romance about a married couple? Is that something that you would consider? And so I've heard that a lot, and I took it as a great creative challenge. I started to think to myself in answer to those questions, well, could I write about a married couple? Is that something that might work for me? And I considered it and considered it. And with Penelope and Eli, I started to think, okay, I think I might be able to see a way to make it work. So in my rough draft of this story, these two were married. And they'd had a big fight before he shipped off. And then the novella opened when he returned, but they were married. And so the plot line surrounding Theo and Aubrey and their baby, that part remained the same, but the romantic conflict was very different in the rough draft because, of course, these two were married in the rough draft, if you can imagine that. So that's what I did last July. And then in 4 months ago, back over Thanksgiving, I rewrote Take a Chance on Me, and then I submitted it to Charlene Patterson, who is a freelance editor now, but used to be my editor at Bethany House. So I completely trust her. She's an excellent editor. And she came back to me and she said, Becky, she's like, the whole married couple thing, it's not working. I'm not feeling it. And as soon as she said that to me, it was hard to hear. And a lot of times writers have to be able to hear very difficult to swallow kinds of feedback and criticism. And it did. It kind of set me into a funk for a little while, but I knew she was right. Like, I had attempted the married couple angle, and I just, at that point, I had to admit that with her very trustworthy feedback, the married couple angle was a swing and a miss. Like, I tried it, and in this case, it didn't work. And so back at the start of January, I fully and completely and totally rewrote Take a Chance on Me. And I made them the single people that you guys read about in the final version. After I changed it drastically, I sent it back to Charlene and we conducted more rounds of edits on it. And then I sent it to, I think, about 5 different beta readers who hunted for typos. And then I sent it to a formatter, and then I got it up at all of the different online bookstores. And then just more recently, I got the print book out. So that is the very exciting and challenging story of how Take a Chance on Me came to be in the end. And also, I had to change the title because Come Back to Me made sense when they were a married couple, and it made no sense at all in this version of the story. So at that point, I changed the title as well to Take a Chance on Me. And then one month ago, I published it. This story ended up being a lot more work than I had bargained for, a lot more work than I had intended, but isn't God faithful? And doesn't that speak to the theme verse of this novel, which is Proverbs 16:9? We can make our plans, but the Lord determines our steps. And that's exactly what played out in the writing of this. I had made my plans. I had determined how much time it would take. I had hoped it would be easy and fun like some of my other novellas, and it wasn't any of those things. It did not go according to my plan, and the Lord determined how it should be, and he was faithful. And there was a moment there where I really considered, when I heard back from Charlene that the married angle was not working, I really considered just putting it on the shelf and not rewriting it. But through the Lord's power, I was able to rewrite it. And so I'm just thankful that I got it out there for you guys. And I hope that you enjoyed it.